over East Asia. So there we know that if we want to look at the regional climate impacts, we have to look at those short-lived climate forces. And let me see, I'm having issues. Okay, and so here, this came about also because we decided through some analysis that we really needed to do it better than CMIP3. CMIP3 was all over the place on aerosol. So this is 3 different models of the US in CMIP3, same scenario, and we could barely agree on what the original value was, and we barely agreed on some of the trends. And then some of the trends, black carbon emissions, we had no idea how to do it. So we decided to do it in a much more coherent fashion, and trying to use a single database to look at those aerosols. And aerosols, if you want to do aerosols in a very comprehensive fashion, the way you have to do it if you want to be able to capture those changes, and I use this just as an example, but I think this is a very telling example. And so one of the things that we did, being going from CMIP3 to CMIP5, is to go from aerosol concentrations in most of the model to being driven by emissions. And that's allow the possibility of looking at a variety of questions that we couldn't before. But you have to have a variety of processes if you want to be able to represent the interaction between aerosols and clouds. But by going with a level of processes that is as broad as what is being indicated here, you can actually also use observations, field observations, that are very specific to the particular process that you're interested in. And to me, this is really the key factor in going with the inclusion of more processes, is leading to something that is closer to the way the Earth system is supposedly working, but also it allows for a better understanding and evaluation of that part of the system as compared to observations. This has led to very interesting, going to CMIP3, there was actually, people were actually more able to use aerosol forcing to correct for some of their climate sensitivity. So a model with high climate sensitivity required to have a total forcing that much lower. So you couldn't really do experiments if you had very high climate sensitivity and very high forcing. So you, in a way, you were able to use aerosol forcing as somewhat of a tuning knob. Not really tuning, but really kind of limiting knob. But going to CMIP5, and this is the equivalent here, there was really no correlation between the adjusted forcing, aerosol forcing, and climate sensitivity. So basically, you just removed some of the intrinsic, by going with more processes, you remove some of the ability of models to be constrained. And yet, and to me, this is one of the key figures that is not really discussed. It's like, people look at this and like, well, nothing changed between CMIP3 and CMIP5. And I would argue there was a lot of things that actually changed. And it was actually somewhat unlikely, considering how much involvement in bringing new processes was done between CMIP3 and CMIP5. There was actually somewhat unlikely that we would get to something that looked very similar, and the models were still able to reproduce the climate change, even though it included a lot more processes than before. Another example that we're seeing right now is towards the land model. And the land model has to interact with a variety of new communities in order to be able to represent all the processes that the land needs to have in order to be doing the carbon cycle that Elena will be discussing later. And so we're now seeing that we need to, in order to be able to develop a land model, we have to connect with different communities, very, very different background, ecology, hydrology, what Ruby will be discussing, biogeochemistry. It makes it for a much more dynamic but much more complicated way of interacting with people. But again, each of those are bringing processes and understanding of processes that can be tested and should lead to a better land model. And in the end, and this is a way too complicated figure, but this is just being informative, what we want is to be able to capture and understand feedbacks in the Earth system. We have to build enough of what is happening in the real world in order to capture those feedbacks. And this is biogeochemistry feedbacks paper from a few years ago, trying to identify positive and negative feedbacks that are occurring once you start bringing more and more of the processes. If you have just CO2, you're very limited in the way you can combine feedbacks that are happening. But then if you start bringing nitrogen in the soil, carbon in wetlands, and so on, then the wealth of feedbacks just becomes larger and larger. One thing that I think we haven't really touched upon at all and will require an even bigger step is evolution. I think there is more and more indication that looking at evolution and adaptability of at least some members of the biology could be really, really key to understanding their future evolution. And this is, again, we're looking at our system models, and we're using them for air quality and diseases, transport, and how that's going to change in the future. So we have to put that, all the research within that context. And this is one where they're looking at changes of malaria, mosquito carrier. And again, if you just look at climate change without evolution, you get one picture. And then if you start including evolution of that mosquito, you can get a completely different picture. You don't need to have the mosquito evolution to get the climate evolution. And so you don't need to have that all the time in the model, going back to my discussion of cutting on and off things that you want to look at. But if you want to have a bigger picture of the way the Earth system functions, then you need to start looking at some of those aspects. And I think this is something that will be important for the next 10 or 15 years, at least. This will take a very long time to get there. So in summary, what I really wanted to highlight in this very short presentation, and I'm sorry if I went too quickly in this overview, but bringing new processes allows for more physically, chemically, biologically observable Earth system model. And this is the key part, this testable part of an Earth system model. But the ensembles are a key component to our understanding of the Earth system and how it might respond to forcing. And so whatever we bring here, we will have to deal with ensemble. And both of those will significantly impact, and we have to balance that with resolution, with existing resources. And there was a very nice summary of that in this recent paper. Oops, why did that happen? Sorry. And from last year, and this is from the ECMWF side of things. But they were looking at model resolution for a 50-member ensemble, looking at what kind of computer resources they were talking about. And so if you want to start looking at resolution, where they're going to be convection scale resolved, and then you're looking at massive increases in the number of computing cores that you need. And this is for weather forecasts, which are much more limited in the duration. And so I think there are very, very large challenges ahead of us, trying to build climate models and Earth system models that are closer and closer to the way the Earth system actually functions, and balance that to the usability, testability, and ultimately using them to make projections that we can use in the future. So that's all I have.
Great, thanks so much.
Any questions?
So first, we can open up to questions for those in the room. Does anyone have any? And I will see if I can unmute those of you online. Okay, so if anyone would like to ask a question, please go ahead. Seeing the hand raised. Yeah. Be shy, please. Well, I'm not seeing any hands raised. No. So, Francois, thank you so much. And maybe at the end we'll have questions if you can stay on.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. Sure.
So our next speaker is Elena, and let me make sure I can unmute you. Okay, Elena, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yes, we can hear you. Let me just introduce you first. So this is our next speaker is Elena Stebliakova from GFDL. She is a senior climate modeler in GFDL's biogeochemistry, ecosystems, and climate group. And she also holds an appointment in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Princeton University. Elena is the co-chair of GFDL's Land Model Development Team, which designs and develops the simulation of land-based physical, biological, and chemical. The climate steers those modules into realistic land models for Earth system studies. So Elena, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Small correction. I'm a physical scientist. I think it's an old title.
Okay, sure.
It's okay. I have room to grow. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to provide some insight in this small time and on critical carbon cycling at GFDL. And at GFDL, I guess we have our own flavor of what we call ESMs. And for us, ESMs, first of all, it's a fully coupled carbon cycle climate model, which is able to actually predict CO2. When the models do not predict CO2, they use atmospheric CO2 concentration. We traditionally refer to them as climate models. So for CMIP5, GFDL has built two different ESMs, ESM2 and ESM3, and John Downs led two papers documenting both papers. And the difference between the two models is just how we formulate the physical ocean model. And going forward, I'm going to show you examples from ESM to GEEP. The results from ESM to M are pretty similar. One of the main characteristics of ESM, in our understanding, is a comprehensive land and ocean biogeochemical dynamics, particularly carbon. The models, our ESM's models, can predict CO2 concentration from emissions of the CO2, and as well they could predict two-way interactions for hydrological and biogeochemical exchanges between atmosphere and land and atmosphere and ocean. Therefore, we could compute fluxes on a time scales as short as half an hour, as long as centuries, exchanging between atmosphere and the Earth biospheres. Such models allow investigation of biophysical and biogeochemical feedback between climate and biosphere, and also could be used for a variety of interdisciplinary impact studies. So this is just a little cartoon to show you what is actually inside of the land model. And on the left, you see this traditional model in the land surface schemes, which use in climate models, which do land energy, water, and carbon exchange, and now they can actually predict exchanges of nitrogen as well with atmosphere. But in addition, in ESMs, you have to have some other new parts, what's traditionally been referred to dynamic vegetation models. And such models need to predict the structure of the vegetation such as characteristics such as leaf area index, height, what kind of root distribution plants have and where the plants are, and also it have to tell how quickly that plant will grow and change in time. And this dynamic vegetation models also include characterizations of mortality, natural or from fires, and biogeography, which means you have to tell where the plants are. And when the biogeography changes in time as a function of climate, we say this model has a dynamic vegetation as opposite to prescribed vegetation, which most models still do. Also, because a lot of changes historically in the future in carbon sinks and sources are going to come not from climate, but directly from human activities, we included land use management module, which tells us what happened with land carbon as people convert natural lands to pastures or crops, or how they harvest lands. I think GFDL is only one model which does harvesting of natural and secondary lands right now in CIMIP 5. So how do we do? ESMs, like traditional climate models, have to predict observed behavior of the climate, such as temperature anomaly. So on the plot here, you see temperature anomaly from ESM to G simulations with all historical forcing. Horizontal axis are going to be time, and this is from 1860 to 2005. Vertical is temperature anomaly. And you can see in black, this is a CRU anomaly from observations. And in different colors here is ESM to G projections of the temperature anomaly. You can see that it actually captures pretty well what happened to temperature, despite the fact the model predicts its own CO2 concentration and distribution of vegetation characteristics. So, but at the same time, ESMs have a task, which I think is pretty challenging, is to predict atmospheric CO2. All these models are driven by the emissions of CO2 coming from fossil fuel and cement production, and all the radiative forcing in land use scenarios. Land use scenarios for CIMIP 5 are defined not in terms of fluxes, but in terms of changes in different kind of areas. For example, what was the fractions of natural lands versus croplands versus pastures. So in the bottom panel, again, this is time, this is CO2 atmospheric CO2 concentration as parts per medium volume. Black line is observed historical CO2 concentration, and the color lines are the projections from the three different ensembles of ESM to G. And it was interesting, this model started to run somewhere in 1700 for us. And then you can see that CO2 concentrations stay on track up to 1940s. And then suddenly there is a change. And there is a diversion in the way we do in the predictions of CO2 in the historically observed atmospheric CO2 concentration. One of the hypotheses we have right now is that it's coming from actually land use scenario itself, particularly how we represent pasture conversions, and it's something we're exploring right now. But in general, so once that split occurs, the difference remains, and it's not growing in time, which is a good sign. So in the same simulations, which predicts the temperature changes, atmospheric CO2 concentration, model tracks for each grid box what are the CO2 fluxes going into ocean and inland. And here I'm showing you the evolution of the land and ocean fluxes over a historical period. Black is a reconstruction from Peter Tan's analysis of the land net flux. It's the total land on all lands. It's what atmosphere sees. Blue is our prediction of the ocean fluxes, and you can see that ocean was a sink since the beginning, and the magnitude of the sink increases. The bar here is AR4 estimate of what with the uncertainty, and so our estimates are within the uncertainty. The green line is sigma is a mean of 3 different ensembles, and different dashed lines are just different ensemble realizations of the land fluxes. So what's interesting, as we know from observation, land flux is much more variable on the decadal time scales, but also it has an interesting pattern. Here you can see zero line, and right now what you can see that in simulations, as been suggested both by Peter Tan's and by our models, land is a source up to some mid-20th century, and then it starts to become a sink. So there is some complex processes happening on land which lead to that behavior, and we believe there are 2 primary drivers of that behavior. It's a combination of what's happening with land use changes and what's happening with CO2 fertilization or enhanced vegetation uptake. That is, as atmospheric CO2 goes up, vegetation takes more and more carbon. It's very uncertain, it's very complicated process, and it's something that I think is a lot of fun we're going to have exploring in CMIP6. So why do we care about land use? Because people actually occupy and manage a large fractions of the land. This is just a caricature. So it's 4 panels representing for present date, average from 1986 to 2005, of 4 different fractions of the land use types. On the left top, you see what's natural. Natural means something which has not been disturbed since 1700. That's something that we get from the George Short scenarios, which were provided for IPCC. Pastures, it's a fraction of pastures. Crops, where the croplands are. And secondary, it's a specific vegetation land use type we use in our model, which describes lands which were, for example, been either harvested for lumber and been left to regrow, or they've been abandoned from agriculture. And surprisingly, the large fraction of the world is occupied by the secondary lands, both in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So, because land use has such a huge imprint historically over historical period, here we show we try to understand how does land use flux changes in time. And land use flux is one of the most uncertain parts of the carbon budget. Typically, people have been using estimates of land use flux in AR5 and AR4 from so-called bookkeeping models which Skihausen developed. And his estimate is 160 gigaton plus minus 50%. That's shown in this figure here. So basically, here again you have time, and here the flux. Positive means it's the flux which goes into the atmosphere. Orange is his estimates, and the gray shaded area is uncertainty. Estimates from the GFDL model are in blue, and you have a couple ensembles here. Purple is from some other model called ESM. So I'm putting it here to show that both our ESM and the standalone ESM model suggest that the flux due to land use activity could have been bigger than the Ski previously suggested, but it's also within his uncertainty range. Also, what's interesting, in Ski's estimate, the land use flux rises, but we actually have a different pattern, that it's high before mid-20th century, and then it kind of goes down. And that could be because of the regrowth of abandoned forests. So, larger land use source implies a larger enhanced land carbon sink. So they are intimately linked in our models, in ESMs. And by design, by the way, ESMs have no missing sink. Whatever we're doing whenever we exchange in carbon between atmosphere, land, atmosphere, ocean, that manifests into changes in atmospheric CO2 concentration. And here's just a little cartoon to show you that in our models, every grid has a collection of different land use styles. It's a particular novel approach we have developed in our lab to represent how the land changes as, primary lands or natural lands are converted to different types of activities. And for secondary vegetation, we keep its age. As forests are regrowing after harvesting, they're getting bigger, bigger, and bigger, and store more carbon. So let me go next. So also, people have been using this concept of the residual carbon sink in the budget. So we similarly compute this value for our ESMs. So what residual carbon sink means is it's a net land sea flux, which, for example, we simulate in historical simulation, minus land use emissions we simulate in these sort of control conditions, because land use flux should not include any enhanced vegetation or, nitrogen fertilization or climate effects. So we estimate that cumulatively over a historical period, residual flux was 187 gigatons. It's a sink. It's negative. So we also did some interesting simulation which says, what if we would not have CO2 fertilization of historical period? Then our residual sink would go away and it's become a source, which suggests to us that enhanced vegetation growth over historical period is very major driver in terms of uptaking the carbon which was emitted by fossil fuel or by land use itself into the atmosphere. One thing which I want to highlight, that in our model, and I think we try to capture what happened in the nature, this residual enhanced sink occurs both on unmanaged and managed lands. And sometimes it's misconception that residual sink only exists on undisturbed lands. This is another way we could look at where those sinks and sources are. This is output from, again, the same simulations. On the left, it's just one particular ensemble run. So black is the same. It's a historical simulation. It's a net land flux. Green is a flux on unmanaged lands, and red is a flux on managed lands. So you can see that, unmanaged lands remain the sink throughout, like ocean, in some sense, always taking up carbon, they're regrowing. And then managed lands, they were pretty much, sourced throughout, like, most of the 20th century, and then they started to go into the sink area. And we could look at the spatial distribution of net land, which is like cumulatively 43 petagrams over the period, of managed lands. And the managed land here with residual flux, it's about 140 petagrams. So it's interesting, like land use emissions over a historical period is half of what fossil fuels were, because they were very high in our simulations up to 1960s, 1970s. So what's happening in the future? This is a big unknown because there's a lot of uncertainty about where those carbon sinks and sources are going. This is a figure from Forrest Hoffman study from multiple models. Each line here is a projections of cumulative land carbon accumulation in ensemble of CIMIP-5 models. GFDL has two models there. It's hard to see has here like two different shades of brown. And this is inserted for the historical period, and this is basically this area. And then you can see that all these models all over the place. So I also want to point that out of these 15 emission-driven ESMs, only 5 or 4, depending how you count, included dynamic vegetation model. All they've been done on the assumption the distribution of vegetation doesn't change. Like both GFDL simulations have that, feature now. All of them use the same land use scenario, but all have different land use implementations. So there's a lot of uncertainty about future uptake. Some of it due to land use change and land use management, how they're represented in the model, and actually what's going to happen in the future, because nobody knows exactly how people are going to develop agriculture or harvest their forests. There's a lot of uncertainty related to nutrient limitations. There's some basic, knowledge like in the Baraka system processes. For example, how do trees die when the drought hits, and what happened under climate change, and how all of these different biogeochemical and the climate changes interact throughout the world in different parts of the ecosystem. So there is multiple challenges. It's just summary for us, but I believe it's a challenges for everybody. So there is a tight coupling between water, carbon, and nutrient cycles. We know that. But all the how they interact at different scales, from 100 meters to 200 kilometers, which is what we usually use in ESMs, it's a big challenge. There's enormous biological diversity. There's like hundreds of thousands of different plant species, and we only could afford running several plant functional types, a dozen at best. There is a huge uncertainty about underlying ecological mechanisms, particularly how nutrients and ecosystem complexity interact, and particularly below ground, and what happened with all the surface heterogeneity, which we still cannot capture in these models. Even if we go to highest resolution we could afford in atmosphere, it might still not be enough to represent the heterogeneity we know exists on the land surface. So we keep improving GFDL land models, and I'm not going to go about what we have. I'm going to highlight a little bit what's happening for LM4, which is our next model. This is what we're building for CIMIP-6. So we're working on improving biogeochemistry, coupling between carbon, nitrogen, methane, BVICs, and possibly phosphorus. We also added to the model other kinds of biogeochemistry, particularly dust and biomass burning, because when trees die, you're going to have more dust. When trees are going to grow, you're going to have less dust in some places, hopefully. So we also tried to figure out how to go beyond land use heterogeneity and represent other kinds of heterogeneity, particularly water-related, which we call hill slopes, because water flows down the hill in grid cells, which could have much more variation in hill slopes than what typical atmospheric land model could catch. We're also developing new vegetation dynamics called 3PPA, which actually has trees instead of carbon boxes, and represent complexity and scaling mechanisms developed by Pakala Group to represent competition between different successional stages. We're improving land use management, particularly fertilizer and water quality and water management. It started to work on initialized type of land models, which is very important for understanding prediction processes. So One of the highlights of our new model is a new soil carbon below ground dynamics, which we, I think, fittingly call CORPS. It has, it stands for Carbon Organism Restoration Protection in the Soil Environment. This model has explicit treatment of microbes, de-acylating dynamic protected carbon pools, and has stronger, more explicit representation of linkages between root dynamics and the carbon dynamics in the soil. It's layered as well. And this is a model to which we're adding nitrogen right now, and the phosphorus is the next. This is a cartoon for how we do in water tiling. So imagine on the left is sort of a typical one grid cell in the LM3. We assume that there is a slope already for doing runoff, but we still grow the same type of vegetation on that grid cell, and we have a similar type of biogeochemistry below. Now what we're doing, we're also slicing like a loaf of bread, that grid cell into different upslopes and downslopes section of the grid, and there is a way to capture water dynamics, not just vertically but horizontally, and different water hill slope tiles have different type of vegetation, and as a result different biogeochemistry inputs. Water is different under each of them, and this is pretty much what's done by us to motivate development of dynamic wetland model and peatlands, and I think it's a very interesting way to capture water heterogeneity within this grid and link it to biogeochemistry. And just highlight what it does to our models here. The 4 panels here. On the left is carbon in the traditional LM3 run. This is a run which has this tile hill slope. We call it tie high, and you can see the difference in the soil carbon is couple of hundreds of petagrams. So just by changing the what kind of water the soil sees, you could actually change how much carbon you store. And the 2 bottom panels show the difference between upland and the lowland, and this is almost like factor of 3 difference between lowland storage and upland storage, and you could particularly see it in South America, which started to have more carbon because it's swamped large fraction of the year. Here's a cartoon for a new dynamic vegetation model. Encheng Wang is a postdoc at Steve Agala's group, led the implementation of the prototype for a temperate site, and we're now expanding that into a tropical region. And those are just 2 examples. Here's a summary of what we're doing. So we, GFDL, in collaboration with Princeton University, USGS, and other collaborators, developed successful terrestrial component of climate ESM models. GFDL ESMs enable analysis of complex and dynamic interactions between land use and ecosystem processes on climate timescales. GFDL and modeling systems allow to capture subgrid heterogeneity in a unique dynamic tiling approach, which also includes fire, which I didn't talk about. We do have 2-way interactions because some people still think it's a challenge, but we do know how to connect atmosphere and biosphere and climate, where the climate sees the changes in the biosphere and the hydrology, and we see changes in climate. It's a lot of new exciting new physical, ecological, and biogeochemistry approaches we're currently building for LM4. But there are still challenges, and evaluation is a big challenge. That's why I think collaboration with a broad community is essential for us. So we have strong partners with Princeton University, KICS, Cooperative Institute for Climate Science, and Princeton Environmental Institute. We're not community model like in CAR, but we try to build our own community and share it with our collaborators. And here is a thank you for all and everyone who works with us at GFDL, Princeton University, and many other places. And thank you and welcome questions.
Elena, thanks. That was excellent. Does anyone have any questions in the room before I open it up?
I can ask a question.
Thank you.
Elena, this is Ken Mooney. For my own self-serving purposes, you mentioned fire, and you didn't talk about it in this talk. What are you doing as far as addressing the fire issue in the Earth system model?
I don't know if I could pull out a slide quickly, but maybe not. Maybe I just describe it. We had a very simple fire model. We had a very simple fire model in LM3, which we call annually pretty much for removing the carbon from the carbon systems. Because we're interested in carbonaceous aerosols, we have implemented a new model, which is a portfolio of 3 models. There's one model for natural and secondary tiles where people do not manage fire as much. They influence it, but they don't manage it. And there are separate parameterization for croplands and the pasture lands. These models simulate fire dynamics at the subdiurnal scales, so it's actually compute area burn every day, and computes emissions of fire from all this fuel is burned. But also what it does, if substantial area is burned, then we take that land, like we did it for the land use, and set it aside and say that's a new tile, which has its own climate and its own biogeochemistry, its own vegetation, and let that tile, which is burned by fire, develop separately. See, that way we could, study and understand how much fire affects seasonal forest dynamics and what are the interactions between different drivers of fire, like natural climate versus humans who sometimes ignite it, sometimes suppress it. So that's something that Sam Rabin, our graduate students, jointly with Steve Pakala's group developed, and this is currently being written up.
Are you thinking about incorporating chemistry associated with fire?
When you say chemistry, I'm not sure if it's answering your question. We have a postdoc here, Daniel Ward, who previously I think was at NCAR, and I think Jean-François familiar with him. Then build emission linkages to the fuel we burn. So he has a coupled version already in testing where the fire emissions from the model being computed for 20 different species, I believe, and those species then pass to the atmospheric chemistry model, CM3. So that's what we're testing right now and see how their prescribed fire and emissions, like from biomass burning, affect the atmospheric chemistry versus, prescribing the emissions from third party or like from some other estimates. So this is right now, it's what we're working on right now to figure out how the chemistry and aerosols affected by interactive fires in our model.
That's exactly what I was asking about. Thank you.
Right.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, there's a couple questions online. Scott Grun is asking, why did atmospheric carbon dioxide pause its increase from 1940 to 1960 as shown in the NOAA observations?
It's actually an interesting question, and let me go to it. So, where is it? It's right here. Oops. That's nobody knows an answer exactly. What's happening in 1950s and 60s, there are 2 different records that combine because Mauna Loa became available after 1950s, and before that as an ice core. So at the same time, it's an interesting socioeconomic period because there's a major world war happening in Europe. So also, I think there might be some interesting climatic period with a climate variability, and if you look at the top panel, it's a period of cooling happening in the record itself. So it's a question we need to explore better, and I think it's ripening for analysis, but it will help us tremendously to get better land use scenarios. That's what we try to understand right now, because one of the reasons we jumped so quickly, because we had a big extra increase in the pasture conversion in the land use scenario itself, but we're not sure if it's sufficient to bring it to plateau in observations. I don't know, does it answer the question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So Anna Rita Mariotti has a question about permafrost changes. Can current models capture Arctic permafrost changes and associated fluxes? And how do uncertainties associated with future permafrost melting compare to other major uncertainties?
I think, let me go somewhere here. LM3 already included a permafrost parameterization, which Chris Mealy developed and documented in the paper he led on the new LM3 physics. So, like, this model does have a frozen water dynamics in the soil. So Charlie Colvin had a comprehensive analysis and compared permafrost active layer dynamics among the CMIP 5 models. So, and I think, like, I don't remember by heart, but, you know, his analysis was doing assessment of what we know and what the models do. But I think the mechanism towards it actually exists in many models, including GFDL ESMs. One of the issues with permafrost, I think, it's a feedback between what kind of carbon organic matter you have and what the physical properties. Because in the model we didn't have a feedback from building a peatland of how does it affect, for example, heat conductivity, heat diffusion. So there's some interesting research to be done there. But I think it's uncertain, but I think we have tools to study it. I think that's the key. And I think, you know, having observation and analysis, which people do on cryosphere, I think it's very important to bring the models together. And my understanding is that there is a suggestion or proposal to have a special report as a part of CMIP 6 on the cryosphere, and I hope that during that report, whoever works on that report will look at the projections and available in this analysis in CMIP 5 already, because a number of centers have provided frozen soil diagnostics. But it's a challenge, as everything in this business.
Okay, great. And then there's another question from Hui Zhang. So you can go ahead and ask the question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, hi, Leah. This is Hui from UT Austin. I'm wondering the soil carbon model. Would you please provide more detailed information about this model? And I'm wondering, is the soil carbon process could significantly impact the effects of simulations? Yeah.
I think the best way to find out about the details of this model is to read Ben Salmon's paper, which he published in Nature Climate Change in 2015. So it has all the equations. It has a result of simulation. If you need to, I'm happy to send you the reference or preprint. But I think what Ben did in that model, he implemented vertical structure, as I said, because before like what Charlie Coleman's model for GOE in our model, we have layers. In CMIP 5, everybody had, including us, boxes, and you didn't know where that carbon was in the soil layer. In the soil column. But now, at least, it's easy to see interaction between physical vertical structure and the carbon and the nitrogen structure. Also, what Ben did, he introduced leaching and the root exudates. And there is some interesting stories he's telling in this paper by looking at different flux tower, like phase experiments, and try to explain some differences between Oak Ridge and Duke phase experiments, which could be related to what happened with the litter interacting with the microbes in the soil. Because by feeding more vegetation litter because of the CO2 fertilization, you could actually affect how soil responds, because you're feeding more yummy carbon to microbes. And I think it's something that also enables us to build methane model upon this model, which is our next ongoing development. But the paper, Salmon et al. Documents the model, and it's publicly, available.
Okay.
Okay, Elena, thanks so much for fielding all the questions. It was a great discussion. So in the interest of time, we should move on now to our final presentation. And that will be given by Ruby Long. And Ruby, I'm going to turn over controls to you. And while I do that, I'll just introduce Ruby. She is a laboratory fellow at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and she's also an affiliate scientist at NCAR. And she is currently the chief scientist of the ACME project, the Accelerated Climate Modeling for Energy project. And that's a major initiative sponsored by the Earth System Modeling Program within the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Biological and Environmental Research. Ruby's research cuts across multiple areas in modeling and analysis of climate and the hydrological cycle, including land-atmosphere interactions, monsoon climate, orographic processes, climate extremes, land surface processes, and aerosol cloud interactions. And so, Ruby, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and start.
Okay, so can you see my desktop?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, all right, great. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to talk in this webinar. And so what I'm going to talk about today is mostly focusing on hydrologic processes. So I feel that the three talks really complement quite well. And so, and also because of in the interest of time, I'm only going to focus on a pretty specific aspect of the model that we are working on, focusing mainly on human activities and how do we represent them and their interactions in the Earth system. So as you know, there are lots of dams and reservoirs around the world, and so we know that 2/3 of the rivers are regulated by dams, and together they store about 15% of the total annual river runoff worldwide. And also, these reservoirs, a lot of the uses are really related to irrigating crops for the agriculture. And so we know that globally, irrigation and deforestation have comparable but opposite effects on water vapor flows from land to the atmosphere. So if we represent land use, land cover change, and not represent irrigation, we would have a problem in terms of correctly simulating this, the evapotranspiration from the surface. So Earth system models really need to represent human-Earth interactions in order to project future climate change. We are really living in the era of Anthropocene, and so we need to be cognizant of the evolving landscapes of climate mitigation and adaptation. So what I'm going to talk about today is only a very limited component of the ACME model, which is the DOE investment in Earth system model, accelerated climate modeling for energy. And so this is a collaborative effort among 8 DOE national labs and involve all components of Earth system models. But as I said, I'm only going to focus on a very limited component and also addressing a particular question related to understanding and quantifying the terrestrial water cycle and its interactions with human activities that drive future changes in the coupled system. So I'm going to touch on a little bit about how do we improve hydrologic representation, and then adding representations of human influence in the coupled Earth system model, and also talking about some of these numerical experiments that we have done, not using the ACME model yet, but those features would be in the ACME model, and so learning about what we might gain by having those features in the model, in particular looking at projecting water scarcity in the future. And so this particular model is really in support of Department of Energy's energy mission, which in a sense we want to be able to represent research questions such as like the nexus among energy, food, land, and the system and the energy. And so first of all, let me talk a little bit about representing hydrologic processes. We all know that topography is an important control on land surface processes, and hydrologic models, they long ago know that, well, in order to represent hydrology, most hydrologic models adopt a subbasin delineation where they represent processes such as here that happen over subbasin or catchments. But in land surface models, we typically use just a regular grid, like a rectangular latitude-longitude structure grid. So one of the questions that we started working on this was to ask, like, does it really matter which representation we use to represent land surface model? So one is a grid-based approach, and the other one is a subbasin-based approach. So in order to answer this question, we performed several different numerical experiments using offline land surface model. In particular, this is based on the community land model. So we ran simulations at 1 degree resolution, ½ degree, ¼ degree, as well as 1/8 degree. And then using the 1/8 degree simulation as our truth, we compare these coarser resolution simulation with the highest resolution simulation and see how much they differ from this highest resolution simulation to give us a sense of the scalability of the model. And so just to cut the chase. So what we found is essentially that by using a subbasin approach, we see significant reduction in the sensitivity of the models to model resolution. So what I show here is the mean absolute error when we compare coarser resolution simulation with the highest resolution. For example, comparing the error of a quarter degree simulation with a 1/8 degree simulation, we see that using a grid-based approach, we have always larger absolute error compared to using a subbasin approach. And these errors really are more and more significant as you go to coarser and coarser resolution, meaning that if you use a latitude, longitude, regular grid-based approach, you will see a significant increase in the absolute error, whereas if you use a subbasin approach, that increase is really very insignificant as you go from quarter degree to 1 degree resolution. So this suggests that the spatial structure that takes advantage of emergent patterns and the scaling properties of atmospheric, hydrologic, and vegetation processes may improve model scalability. And so next, we work on adding components to the model that allow us to really look at these interactions between human activities and the hydrological cycle. And an important link across human activities and the hydrological cycle is really through the river network. So essentially, we have a lot of stream flow in the river, and humans withdraw the flow from the river for irrigation and other uses. So in order to represent these processes, we have developed this so-called model for scale adaptive river transport. We call it the MOSART model. So essentially, this is a river transport model developed in a way to allow us not only to simulate stream flow, but also with a structure that allows us to expand on that would be able to simulate also the energy components such as stream temperature, as well as biogeochemistry in the river, so that we will be able to transport nutrients and sediment and things like that from land over to the ocean. So this is the basic design of the model, where we first of all represent in a subgrid sense. We look at the hill slope routing, and then we route through a subgrid network, which is essentially the tributaries, and then we also represent the channel routing over the main channel. And then we use this method allow us to really simulate not only the stream flow amount, but also the river velocity, water depth, etc., which is a structure we need in order to simulate the biogeochemistry of the rivers. So just to make it shorter, I'm just going to tell you a comparison between the observed stream flow and the model simulated stream flow. And we look at two different parameters. One is called the annual maximum flood, which is shown by the red crosses. And the other one is simply the mean annual flow. And so each dot here corresponds to one particular stream gauge for the comparison. And what you see is that doesn't matter whether we are looking at mean annual flow or the maximum annual flood, the model always tends to produce more or higher amount compared to the observation. And this is mainly because a lot of the rivers are really strongly affected by dams, and therefore as a result of the withdrawal of the water in the reservoirs for different purposes, the actual amount of stream flow and the floods are really quite a bit lower than what the model represents. So this motivated us to look at water management and also represent water management in Earth system model. So essentially, water management model regulate the flow by reservoir operations, and we are not trying to represent every single reservoirs and how they are managing every single reservoir differently. But what we developed is a generic way to represent the function of a reservoir, which are essentially to control flood and then provide water for irrigation. And also in some of the river basins, the reservoirs also perform a joint function of regulating for irrigation as well as flood control. So we developed generic rules to do the release of the reservoir, the water from the reservoirs, and then change the storage target for the different purposes of the reservoirs. And this is just an example over the U.S. These are the reservoirs, over 1,800 reservoirs that we represented in the U.S. And by considering the joint irrigation and flood control, we were able to simulate the reservoir water level quite well when you look at this combined rule, which is shown in blue, versus the black, which is the observed water level in the Grand Coulee Reservoir, compared with if we only look at irrigation or only look at flood control alone. And next, we also look at the impacts of water management. Since now we have such a model in our Earth system model, we look at the impacts of water management on both stream flow as well as stream temperature. So essentially what we are seeing is that in the early summer season, having a reservoir essentially regulates the stream flow, and most of the effect is really to reduce the stream flow amount, for example, in the central United States. And corresponding to this reduction in the stream flow, we see an increase in the stream temperature because the flow rate is lower, and therefore the water has more interaction with the surface and the air temperature, and therefore causing an increase in the stream temperature. And so being able to simulate both the stream flow and the stream temperature is important, particularly for energy consideration, because stream temperature is regulated to protect fish and ecosystems, and therefore when the stream temperature is too high, power plants would have to be shut down in order not to further increase the stream temperature to affect the fish and ecosystem. And therefore these are some of the modeling capabilities that we have built into our Earth system model, particularly related to the land surface model, that we are able to capture the effects of human activities. So here, just a very brief summary of the model skill. So we look at simulation when we added water management and how well the model performed in terms of simulating stream flow and stream temperature. So these values we show here are the so-called Nash-Sutcliffe value, essentially kind of like a correlation between observation and model simulation. So if we see a golden color, it means that adding water management doesn't increase or reduce the skill. Black color means adding management actually reduces the skill of the model in capturing the reality, but red means adding water management will improve the skill in capturing the observed. And we can see that for both stream flow and stream temperature, mostly we see red and golden color, meaning that adding water management really helps the model to be able to capture the amount as well as the seasonality, etc., in terms of the stream flow and the stream temperature. So now we'll take this model and then try to use it to answer some questions. So one question we are particularly interested in is how do human decisions about energy and agriculture affect water demand, and as a result, how does that affect water deficit or water scarcity? And so this is a study published in 2013 where they look at where bioenergy crops can be grown under a stringent climate mitigation policy, and also asking the question whether we have sufficient water to really support the production of these bioenergy crops. So this particular study shows that around the world, there are many regions in the future that would be expected to grow a lot more bioenergy crop in order to mitigate climate change. And because of that, there was significant increase in the water demand that would be needed in order to grow the bioenergy crop. So areas where they see important increase in the water demand are, for example, the eastern U.S. as well as some other regions such as China. So if we look at the U.S. in particular, we look at two different scenarios, the so-called RCP 8.5, which is a typical business as usual scenario, versus a mitigation scenario, which is RCP 4.5. And here what we show is our model results coming from these so-called integrated assessment models. So these are the models that have been used to produce different climate emission scenarios and land use, land cover scenarios that have been used in CMIP 5 to project climate changes. And so here the vertical bars are showing the electricity generation based on different technology. So just briefly scanning the two figures here, you can see that the big difference between these two scenarios really lie in particularly this area. as well as this area in light purple, as well as light green. So the light purple color essentially corresponds to coal, but with carbon capture technology. So this is a mitigation scenario where with this kind of technology, we can significantly reduce emission in the future. But another means of getting reduction in the emission in the future is really by growing bioenergy crop corresponding to this particular area here. So this again motivated us to look at how by increasing the growth of bioenergy crop may change water demand and therefore change water scarcity. So just to show you the results without showing a lot of the details, so we use our models with water management as well as with stream flow and hydrology, simulating soil hydrology, etc., together with integrated assessment model that simulate the water demand. So here the top figure shows the county level annual water deficit as a function of water demand. And so what we mean by water deficit is essentially the difference between water supply and water demand. And water demand can be related to irrigation for crops. It can also be related to simply domestic water use to support the increasing population, etc. And water supply is essentially simply defined as the difference between precipitation and evapotranspiration, and therefore the amount of stream flow we have in the rivers. And so we see that even for the current climate scenario, the model simulated quite a lot of area with pretty significant water deficit. And we can identify that these are actually the areas where, indeed, if we base on surface water supply alone, we would not be able to support irrigation and the human population. But the reason why we actually don't have water deficit now is because we have been pumping a lot of groundwater in these areas. But if we only consider surface water, this is the water deficit that we see in the current climate condition. And in projecting into the future, we look at 2020s, 2050s, and 2080s in two different scenarios. We see that particularly for the RCP 4.5 scenarios, which is supposed to be a mitigation scenario that reduces the warming in the future, we actually see larger increases in the water deficit in the future compared to the RCP 8.5, suggesting that a mitigation scenario that reduces warming is not necessarily a scenario that will give you more water supply or give you less water stress. So to understand why, so we look at 15 different river basins. Particularly here, we compare purple color is the 4.5 scenario, and green is the 8.5 scenario. We look at both supply and demand to tell the difference. So these are essentially the cumulative density function. So let's take a look at, for example, one particular basin here, Upper Mississippi River Basin. If we look at water supply, which are the solid lines in two different colors, we see that the water supply in the future in a 4.5 scenario, which is the purple, compared to the 8.5, which is in green. Indeed, by mitigating climate change, we get reduction in the warming in the future. And a very simple argument for this increase in the water supply is simply that there is a reduction in the ET, the water vapor, because of the warming, the reduced warming. But at the same time, when we look at the changes in the demand, we also see that in the future, the demand associated with 4.5 is larger than the demand associated with the 8.5 scenario, suggesting that there is actually a tug of war between reducing, increasing water demand as well as increasing the water supply, which as a result cause a net increase in the water deficit in the future in a 4.5 scenario. And so then one might ask, well, but remember I mentioned that a deficit in the surface water supply doesn't necessarily mean that we have a water deficit, because we can continue to pump groundwater. And so we have also another study where we look at how sustainable is groundwater pumping for irrigation. And so in this particular study, we implemented a way to actually represent groundwater pumping for irrigation. in the U.S., you can actually see that there are many major areas where groundwater pumping is a general practice in order to get enough water to supply for irrigation. So the biggest area is really the Ogallala Aquifer. This is the area where 90% of the irrigation water actually comes from groundwater. But we also have areas such as Arizona and also California, as well as part of Washington State, where quite a bit of the irrigation water also comes from groundwater pumping. So using our land surface model, we simulate the impacts of groundwater pumping on the groundwater table. And interestingly, we see that in 3 locations that we look at, for example, the Pacific Northwest, California, and also the southern Great Plains, such as the lower Mississippi River Basin, we see that groundwater pumping is really not quite sustainable in the sense that if we pump groundwater, the recharge rate from precipitation back to recharge for the groundwater is very low, so that you would see a constant reduction in the groundwater table as a result of groundwater pumping. On the other hand, there is only one area that we look at, which is the lower Mississippi River Basin, because of the particular soil type and conditions, that even with groundwater pumping, the recharge rate coming back from the irrigation and as well as the precipitation to recharge the groundwater aquifer is actually quite high, and therefore there isn't a lot of reduction or lowering of the groundwater table. So I think these are important considerations when we look at the future in terms of the combined effects of different human activities and how that might change irrigation, and which then might feed back to the atmospheric system in terms of ET and precipitation. So just as a quick summary, so modeling Earth and human-Earth interaction, I think, is important for projecting climate changes because, as I said, we are already now in the era of the Anthropocene. So human activities can perturb climate through direct forcing as well as feedbacks, such as like irrigation. But they are also influenced by climate. So if in a warmer climate condition, maybe certain human activities cannot really be supported. And we also mentioned that mitigation can influence climate, and that's the purpose of climate mitigation. But at the same time, mitigation is also constrained by climate change. A warmer climate that increases ET might have a different effects compared to a climate environment where you would have a significant increase in the water demand, but the climate is not able to support that kind of irrigation. So human activities are inherently local to regional scale. So if we want to represent human Earth, I think that further motivates the needs for higher resolution modeling, and I think this is one modeling challenge that we have to face. And then lastly, by introducing additional processes related to human activities and the interactions with the Earth system, no doubt we are introducing more uncertainty to the model, but although at the same time these kind of impacts are important to represent in an Earth system sense. So in any case, the uncertainty needs to be understood and quantified. Okay, so that's all I have.
Hey, great, Ruby. Thank you so much. Are there any questions in the room? Okay, I see one question online from Anna Rita Riotti. It's a clarification question. Has the model incorporated chronological seasonal mean water management or actual time-varying water management? And is such data available?
Right. So the water management is simulated dynamically based on the climate simulation itself. For example, if the climate simulates a certain seasonality of the precipitation and the runoff, then essentially we apply different rules for the release and the storage target to manage the reservoir to be able to provide for the irrigation water and provide for the flood control. So it's dynamically simulated and it's time varying. Yeah. And also dependent on the region. I mean, different regions have different seasonality of precipitation and stream flow, and therefore the reservoirs would be managed differently, although the rules themselves are generic.
So Andrea is asking how the approach is validated.
Yeah, we validate the approach using, for example, stream flow measurement, as well as there are reservoir water level that we can use to evaluate whether the model capture the water level. And then there are also, for example, satellite data that can provide information about the reservoir water level and the surface area of the reservoir, which are also very important and useful data to evaluate the model.
Okay, thanks. Great. Well, with that, I want to thank very much each of the three speakers for really excellent talks, and thank everyone for joining. And I just want to advertise that the next webinar will be in February 18th, and that will be in a pretty different topic, atmospheric blocking and links to extremes, and that will be Earth system prediction capability focused webinar that's co-sponsored by the Office of Weather and Air Quality and OAR. So you can stay tuned for an announcement on that. And then in March, there will be a webinar on prediction of high water levels. Okay, so thanks very much, and we hope to see you in February.